The in-laws laughed at her humble dress during the wedding, but when she took the microphone and read a letter from her late mother, what she revealed about her past left everyone speechless and filled with remorse. Sophia bowed her head over the light wooden surface where the dress she had been working on for weeks rested. The late afternoon light entered through the single window of the small makeshift workshop where threads, fabrics and needles lay scattered in an intimate order only she understood. She had spent hours refining tiny details, checking the stitching on the sleeves and making sure the lace fit perfectly against the satin. Every stitch was a silent dialogue with the memory of her mother, who had passed away several years before, yet remained present in each piece of fabric the young woman worked with infinite dedication. Long ago, when Sophia was just a child, her mother had taught her how to hold the needle firmly, not to fear the occasional prick on her fingertips, and to admire the value of honest work. It wasn't just about sewing, it was about understanding effort and patience, about tending to every detail without forgetting the love you pour into what you create. Her mother had been a seamstress in difficult times, and with a smile and a whispered encouragement, she had shown Sophia that through sewing, one could express inner strength and respect for life's simple things. This dress was not just any design. It was inspired by a sketch that Sophia and her mother had drawn on a sheet of paper when she was very young. Her mother had imagined, amid laughter and affection, what Sophia's wedding gown would look like someday. No excessive luxuries or ostentatious fabrics, only the subtlety of a design that reflected her essence, her humble origins, and her ability to transform simplicity into something profoundly beautiful. Now, that old sketch, rescued from a drawer of memories, had become a reality in her hands, a tribute to the woman who had guided her from the very start. As she finished adjusting a delicate edge around the neckline, she heard soft footsteps outside the door. Marco, her fiancé, entered the workshop cautiously. Tall, with a kind face and a frank gaze, he carried a worry he tried to disguise with a sympathetic smile. He watched Sophia with affection, recognizing in her the talent and dedication his own parents seemed unable to appreciate. Carla and Ernesto, the Castillos, had expressed their dissatisfaction with their son's choice more than once. They did not understand what Marco saw in that young seamstress, a girl without a grand family name or fortune. For them, the ideal bride should wear family heirloom jewels and a dress worthy of international runways, not a gown made in an improvised workshop. Even so, Marco admired Sophia. He knew that despite her apparent fragility, she possessed an admirable inner strength, forged by years of effort and self-improvement. Each time he tried to reassure her, telling her she looked beautiful and that her talent would outshine any prejudice, she would reply with a gentle smile, even if uncertainty flickered in her eyes. Sophia was fully aware of how complicated it was to fit into the Castillos' world. Neither Marco's tender words nor his silent gestures of support could quell the malicious comments and mocking smiles that she had already begun to hear behind the doors of the family mansion. Still, she would not be intimidated. That dress, modest in appearance but exquisite in its craftsmanship, was a symbol of her own identity. She had no interest in dazzling with luxury, but rather in honoring her mother's memory, stitching into every seam the story of her life and thereby reflecting the values that her late mother had instilled in her heart. Resilience, hard work, love for simplicity, and the dignity of well-done labor constituted the true adornment of that wedding gown. When Marco gently asked if she was ready for the big day, Sophia lifted her gaze from the dress. Her eyes showed a mix of excitement and nerves, but also determination. She knew that the path to the altar would be lined with judgmental stares and contemptuous remarks, yet she had no intention of betraying her essence. In that small workshop, surrounded by threads and memories, she had created more than just a dress. She had woven a bridge between her past and her future. And that bridge, supported by her mother's love and a respect for her origins, would lead her to face whatever lay ahead with her head held high. The appointed day had arrived, and the chosen hall for the ceremony exuded a luxury that felt almost oppressive. The columns, wrapped in delicate fabrics, and the enormous floral arrangements seemed to compete for attention with crystal chandeliers and exquisitely decorated tables, though the overall effect was cold. The gentle notes of a string quartet filled the air, attempting to lend an air of solemnity to an event that, rather than love, seemed to breathe ostentation. Sophia advanced toward the altar with firm steps. Her dress, born from childhood sketches, carefully chosen threads, and memories of her mother, stood in stark contrast to its surroundings. The shimmering silks and expensive lace worn by other guests made the simplicity of her own gown even more noticeable. This piece, made by her own hands, did not aim to dazzle with luxury, but to embody the wearer's essence. However, to those who valued only material worth, the dress was nothing more than an unforgivable lack of class. As Sophia continued her way, the guests inclined their heads toward each other, whispering comments that gradually grew louder. Short phrases, tongue clicks, discreet laughter, and even some mocking glances were heard. There were renowned businessmen, noted socialites, and members of illustrious families, all summoned by the Castillos to witness their son's union with a young woman who, in their judgment, did not understand the rules of their world. Carla, Marco's mother, watched the scene with a frown. Seated at a principal table with Ernesto by her side, she made no effort to hide her displeasure. Her voice, though soft, carried a subtle venom that easily reached those near her. "I don't understand how Marco allowed something so ordinary into our family," she said, looking disdainfully at Sophia's dress as if it were a piece unfit for the refinement she believed she possessed. Ernesto, more reserved, let out a complicit sigh and nodded, trying not to draw attention, but sharing his wife's displeasure. The Castillo family had spent large sums to decorate the hall, hire the best gourmet catering, and ensure that everything looked immaculate. In their eyes, Sophia's dress was an affront to that effort, a stain on the perfect canvas they had envisioned. Carla could not bear the thought that her son's future wife did not understand etiquette, appearances, and the weight of carrying their last name. Ernesto, although slightly more cautious, also believed Sophia, with her simplicity, did not fit the mold that the family had to perpetuate. Meanwhile, Marco, standing by the altar, felt the pressure closing in around him. He watched Sophia walk with dignity, her face serene despite the evident hostility in the room. He loved her deeply, admired her talent and conviction. Yet something inside him trembled at the thought that, at this very moment, his parents and many of the guests did not value her. He was a man caught between two loyalties, the one he owed to his family, the world in which he had been raised, and the one he felt towards Sophia, the symbol of honesty and the sincere, hard-working spirit he so needed in his life. The tension intensified when Carla, making no real effort to lower her voice, released another spiteful jab that reached Sophia's ears. "I thought she'd at least dignify herself by wearing something more appropriate, considering who she's marrying," she murmured. The cold, merciless ridicule struck Sophia's heart, though she maintained her composure. Outwardly, her face remained steady, her lips pressed gently together, refusing to display pain. Inwardly, however, she felt a fresh wound open. Her mother had taught her to be strong, but that did not mean words failed to hurt. Sophia tightened her grip slightly on the bouquet in her hands, took a deep breath, and continued forward. She knew her dress would not bend before scornful looks, and that with each step she took, she remained true to herself, to her past, and to her mother's memory. At that moment, despite it all, she decided she would not allow others' humiliation to tarnish the intimate, sacred meaning of this day. The reception unfolded in a dual atmosphere, reflecting the palpable tensions between those who supported Sophia and those who watched her with cold detachment. The tables were adorned with elegant centerpieces and fine china, but the sparkle of the crystals and the glow of the lights could not hide the disapproving glances directed at the young bride. Among the attendees Sophia's close friends exchanged supportive smiles and encouraging words, while the members of the Castillo family maintained a chilly distance, their rigid gestures revealing their disdain. As the evening progressed, the tension mounted, and Sophia felt a mixture of determination and vulnerability. She decided that the time had come to express what she held inside, to share the true essence of her dress and honor her mother's memory. She waited until the conversations subsided, seizing the moment when the crowd's attention turned toward the host, to take the microphone. With her heart pounding, Sophia approached the podium. Marco, sensing the urgency in her movements, gave her a reassuring nod. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of every gaze upon her, and began to speak in a voice that, though steady, trembled slightly with suppressed emotion. "This dress is not just a garment," Sophia said, looking around before focusing on the eyes of those present. "It is a dream my mother and I shared. When I was a child, we used to draw what my wedding dress would look like. She taught me to sew and to work with love in everything I did." Her words resonated throughout the room, capturing everyone's attention. Some began to nod, moved by her sincerity. Sophia continued, her voice gaining strength as tears began to fill her eyes. "My mother fought a terminal illness while making this dress. Each stitch represents her love, her sacrifice, and her wish for me to have something special on the most important day of my life." Gently, Sophia pulled out a folded letter, previously hidden in a pocket of her dress. Her hands trembled slightly as she held it before the guests. "I'd like to share something my mother wrote before she passed away," she announced, letting the silence envelop the room. She opened the letter and began to read, her voice laden with emotion and longing. "Dear Sophia, this dress is my gift to you, a symbol of all that I have learned and loved. Through sewing, I have tried to pass on to you the strength, the resilience, and the love for simplicity that I have always felt. May you remember, each time you wear it, that I will always be with you, guiding you and supporting you in every step of your life." The hall fell completely silent, broken only by the sound of her voice and the quickening of her heartbeat. The letter's words touched the deepest fibers of many present, even those who had previously made disparaging comments. The reproachful looks toward Sophia began to soften, replaced by expressions of respect and admiration. However, Carla and Ernesto remained unmoved, their features hardened, reflecting a palpable discomfort. Instead of being moved, they perceived Sophia's speech as an intrusion into their event, an attempt to steal the spotlight they believed they deserved. Carla, forcing a smile, tried to mask her scorn. "It's a lovely story, Sophia," she commented, though her words failed to achieve the warmth she intended. Ernesto, on his part, kept a serious expression, arms crossed as he watched Sophia with a mix of skepticism and annoyance. The atmosphere grew tense, and the contrast between the guests' reactions revealed the first cracks in what should have been a day of unified celebration. Marco, sitting beside Sophia, gently squeezed her hand in a gesture of support. Despite the discomfort he felt due to his parents' reaction, he knew that Sophia had acted with bravery and authenticity. His love and respect for her became even more evident in that moment, reaffirming the bond that united them beyond external differences. Sophia, feeling the weight of the gazes and emotions around her, softly lowered the letter and took a deep breath. She had shared an essential part of her story, hoping that those present could understand the depth of her connection to the dress and her mother. Although tensions with the Castillos persisted, she had planted the seed of empathy and recognition in many hearts. The reception continued, but the atmosphere had subtly changed. Whispers of approval and admiration mingled with some still skeptical comments, but Sophia felt a renewed inner strength. She had taken a crucial step toward acceptance and understanding, defending her dignity and the profound meaning of that dress, which represented much more than a mere garment. Amid the duality of affection and coldness, Sophia emerged with a renewed clarity about who she was and what she truly valued. leaving a lasting impression on all present. After the wedding, Sophia found herself immersed in the task of organizing the memory boxes she had inherited from her mother. The small apartment she now shared with Marco was filled with history-laden objects, black and white photographs, yellowed letters evoking past moments. Each box was a journey into the past, an opportunity to reconnect with the woman who had so greatly influenced her life. As she unpacked a particularly dusty box, Sophia discovered a carefully folded newspaper clipping. She gently pulled it out, revealing a large, enigmatic headline, "Tragic Fire at Los Alamos Textile Factory." The article detailed a devastating fire that had occurred over 30 years ago, leaving several workers injured and others in precarious conditions. Reading the headline sparked a pang of curiosity. She vaguely remembered her mother mentioning that factory, though they had never delved deeply into what had happened. Sophia held the clipping up to the light, trying to recall any fragments of conversation where her mother had spoken about that place. Memories were blurry, fragmented by time and loss. However, the mention of a large textile company that managed the factory awakened something within her. Why hadn't her mother shared more information? What secrets did that tragedy conceal? Determined to understand more, Sophia placed the clipping in a folder with other documents and decided to bring it up at the family dinner she had recently organized with the Castillos. She wanted to see how her in-laws would react to the topic, searching for clues about what truly happened at that factory. The dinner was a formal occasion, with the table adorned with an impeccable white tablecloth and silver candlesticks reflecting soft light. The dishes served were a showcase of haute cuisine, meticulously prepared by the Castillo's personal chef. Despite the elegant atmosphere, an underlying tension was palpable in the air, especially between Sophia and her in-laws. During the meal, as wine flowed and conversations intertwined between trivialities and forced courtesies, Sophia seized a calm moment to take the newspaper clipping out of her folder. With a carefree smile, she said, "I found this clipping about a fire at Los Alamos Textile Factory. I was surprised to see that company was so large. Did you know anything more about what happened there?" Carla, Marco's mother, looked up from her plate, slightly furrowing her brow. Her eyes showed a mix of surprise and annoyance, as if mentioning that accident had touched a sensitive nerve. "Ah, yes. Those kinds of accidents unfortunately happen in any industry," she responded in a cold and evasive tone, avoiding eye contact. Ernesto, more reserved but equally uncomfortable, momentarily set aside his fork and wiped his hands before replying. "It's unfortunate, but it's not something we should delve into now that we're celebrating our families joining together," he added, quickly diverting the conversation to safer topics like recent investments and social events. Sophia carefully observed her in-laws' reactions. Carla seemed to try to hide her discomfort behind a facade of indifference, while Ernesto maintained a rigid posture, clearly uneasy with the direction the conversation had taken. Sophia, with her observant nature, noticed the subtleties in their gestures and tones of voice, sensing that there was more to the story than they were willing to reveal. Throughout the dinner, Carla and Ernesto's responses remained vague and evasive. They offered no further details about the factory or the fire, and any attempt by Sophia to delve deeper into the subject was gently but firmly deflected. It was evident that something was being hidden, that secrets lay buried behind that tragedy that her mother had never disclosed. After dinner, as Marco cleaned up the last remnants of the meal, Sophia reflected on what had happened. Her in-laws' discomfort had ignited a spark of determination within her. She knew she needed to investigate further, to uncover the truth behind the fire and understand why her mother had been so reserved about it. A mix of intuition and curiosity drove her not to let silence stand between her and the answers she sought. That night, Sophia sat at the small desk in her room, illuminated by the soft light of a lamp. She spread the newspaper clipping in front of her and opened her diary, determined to jot down every detail that could connect the pieces of the puzzle. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, reminding her of the importance of resilience and the pursuit of truth. With a deep sigh, she began to write, aware that this discovery could unearth secrets that would change her perception of her family and her own past. In the silence of the night, Sophia realized that her quest was not just about a forgotten accident, but about understanding the roots of her own story and the memory of the woman who had been her guide and inspiration. With every word she penned on the paper, she took a step closer to unveiling the mysteries surrounding her mother and the Los Alamos textile factory, prepared to face whatever came her way with the determination that had always defined her. The days following the uncomfortable dinner with the Castillos were marked by a heavy atmosphere and increasing unease in Sophia and Marco's home. The young woman tried to contain her anxiety, reminding herself to stay strong, but each evasive gesture from Marco only fueled her doubts. That night after dinner, Sophia had attempted to address the topic of the clipping and her in-laws' strange reaction, hoping that Marco would support her and perhaps offer some explanation. "I don't want to create unnecessary conflicts," was the response she received from her husband, in a tone that sought to sound conciliatory but actually felt weak. "Unnecessary conflicts," Sophia replied, disbelief reflected in her eyes. "Marco, I'm not making anything up. Your parents became tense just by mentioning that fire. It seemed like it touched on a forbidden topic." Marco looked at her with a hurried expression, as if wishing to end the conversation before it escalated. "It's not that it's a forbidden topic, it's just... I don't know, maybe it's not worth dredging up old issues," he said, shrugging his shoulders. "Besides, we just got married. Why complicate our lives with old stories?" These responses, far from calming Sophia, set off an alarm within her. Marco's evasion sounded like capitulation to a silent mandate imposed by his family, and it only underscored the dominant role the Castillos played in their lives. Sophia loved him, but now she understood the difficulty of fighting against the weight of such deep-rooted ties. Her husband seemed torn between defending her and turning a blind eye to maintain peace. "Why is everyone acting like this topic is a secret?" Sophia insisted, her whisper laden with disappointment. "Don't I deserve to know why they reacted that way?" Marco had no answer. He looked down, uncomfortable, and awkwardly changed the subject, leaving Sophia increasingly convinced that there was something dark behind that incident. That night, as she tried to fall asleep, a myriad of questions pounded in the young woman's mind. What role had her mother played in that factory? Why did the simple clipping of an old fire cause such discomfort in the Castillos? Meanwhile, elsewhere in the city, Carla and Ernesto were arguing behind closed doors in their luxurious residence. Carla, with her characteristic imperious tone, did not hide her annoyance. "We can't let her keep digging. Sophia has already shown too much curiosity, and that doesn't work in our favor," she affirmed, pacing the room with short, tense steps. Ernesto, sitting in a leather armchair, maintained a stern expression. He was more reserved than his wife, but no less aware of the danger posed by his daughter-in-law's curiosity. "We should talk to Marco. He can convince her to drop the subject, or at least distract her," he suggested calmly. Carla nodded, but without losing her worried demeanor. "If we can't manage it that way, we'll have to think of something more drastic," she said, without specifying what the next step would be. For the first time in a long while, both felt threatened, as if a ghost from the past was about to emerge from the shadows. The tension was palpable. Sophia, for her part, began to connect the dots, piecing together the loose fragments she had gathered. The newspaper clipping, Carla and Ernesto's evasive reactions, Marco's indifference to her questions, and the vague memories of her mother mentioning the factory in a low voice some time ago. Although she still lacked concrete evidence, her intuition told her that she was dealing with a well-guarded secret. Alone, with her diary open on her desk, Sophia reviewed her notes. She remembered her mother's teachings, to persevere, not to be intimidated by the walls others built. Since childhood, she had been instilled with the value of digging into the truth, of understanding the world beyond appearances. Now, she felt it was time to put those lessons into practice, no matter the cost. Sophia understood that her investigation could disrupt the fragile balance in her newly formed family, but she was not willing to ignore the signs. Determination grew within her, aware that the answers would not come without effort, and perhaps not without consequences. Something dark was lurking behind those evasions, and she felt ready to unearth it, even if it meant confronting not only her in-laws, but also the doubt Marco sowed each time he avoided the truth. In the following days, Sophia immersed herself in a silent investigation that led her to walk dusty streets, forgotten libraries, and corners of collective memory that no one seemed willing to recall. With the newspaper clipping in hand, she entered the local library for the first time, a modest building with crowded shelves and the scent of aged paper. There, among yellowed newspapers, the young woman sought echoes of a past many had wanted to bury. The editions of local newspapers from decades past detailed the fire that had devastated the textile factory. According to the articles, the fire spread quickly on a fateful night, leaving behind a trail of ashes and pain. Several workers were seriously injured, some left with permanent scars that condemned them to precarious situations. What troubled Sophia was the absence of mentions about fair compensation or any form of accountability from the owners. Instead, the chronicles seemed to repeat the same idea, presenting the tragedy as an inevitable misfortune, a fatality without clear culprits. Sophia suspected that someone had manipulated the media coverage. The lack of subsequent reports, the absence of legal actions, and the authorities' silence revealed a deep crack. Who had enough influence to silence so many voices? Gradually, the idea that the Castillo surname was behind this story began to take shape in her mind, becoming a heavy suspicion. As she flipped through one last old newspaper, a librarian with white hair and a friendly demeanor approached her. Seeing her interest in the case, the woman quietly mentioned that she vaguely remembered that tragedy. She said that many of the workers had ended up in miserable economic situations without compensation or insurance to protect them. Many years later, there was a small community of former workers who still gathered on the outskirts of the city, trying to support each other. Intrigued, Sophia asked for more information, and to her surprise, the librarian provided her with an address and a phone number, whispering, "Don't be afraid to ask them. They hold the memory that no one else wants to rescue." With that lead, Sophia headed to a humble neighborhood, far from the shine and pomp of her husband's family. There, in a simple house with a neglected garden, awaited a group of older women. Some had hunched backs from the years, others with hands deformed by arthritis, but their eyes retained a sparkle of wounded dignity. They cautiously received her at first, not understanding who she was and why she showed interest in those forgotten stories. But when Sophia mentioned her mother's name, a murmur ran through the group. It seemed that the collective memory united them around an unspoken truth. Through several conversations, Sophia listened to heartbreaking testimonies. The women spoke of exhausting shifts, lack of safety measures, bosses who ignored warnings about defective machines and exposed electrical wires. Gradually, the picture of negligence took shape. Among the painful phrases emerged a crucial detail. The factory was owned by the Castillos, the very same who were now her in-laws. She held a lump in her throat as she confirmed the suspicion growing within her mind. One of the most striking testimonies came from a woman who vividly remembered Sophia's mother. She recounted how that skilled-handed, kind-hearted woman had attempted to organize the workers to demand fair compensation after the fire. However, before she could advance her plan, she was dismissed without hesitation. The account struck Sophia in the chest. Her mother, so discreet and loving, had waged a silent battle that she never knew existed. "Your mother was a fighter," said the elderly woman with a trembling voice. "She wanted justice, but they silenced her." Those words ignited a burning indignation in Sophia's heart, a cocktail of anger and sadness. It pained her to know that her mother had suffered more than she had imagined, that she had tried to protect others and had paid a high price. At the same time, this discovery filled her with determination. She had to continue investigating, find evidence, and bring to light what so many had strived to conceal. As she said goodbye to the women, Sophia felt that her mission was now clearer than ever. It was not just about understanding the past, but about honoring the memory of her mother and all those invisible workers, victims of power and silence. If the Castillos had so much to hide, she would ensure that this time no one could silence the truth. Sophia returned home with determination reflected in her gaze. She had spent days interviewing those older women, listening to the truth that had been kept hidden for decades amid silences and fearful glances. Now, with the puzzle pieces clearer, she felt it was time to share everything with Marco. She wanted him to understand the magnitude of the situation, the connection between his family and the tragedy that had marked so many workers, including her mother. That same afternoon, when Marco arrived from work, he found Sophia waiting for him in the living room. She invited him to sit beside her on the sofa and, with a serene yet firm voice, began to recount what she had discovered. She spoke to him about the textile factory, the fire, the precarious conditions the workers were left in, and the role the Castillos had played in that dark story. Every word resonated powerfully, as if the voices of the victims merged with hers. At first, Marco reacted with disbelief. He crossed his arms, furrowing his brow, as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. "My parents never spoke about that," he said, with a defensive tone that showed confusion. Throughout his life, he had seen Ernesto and Carla as stern authority figures, yes, but also as people who valued prestige, family, and responsibility. How could they be involved in something so atrocious? Sophia looked at him calmly and showed him the notes, the clippings, the transcripts of the testimonies. "I've spoken with former workers, Marco. Your family owned the factory. There was negligence, indifference toward the safety of those who worked there. Your father, your mother, all of them, knew what was happening and they hid it," she explained, her heart pounding. Silence took over the room for a few moments. Marco reviewed the papers with an increasingly furrowed brow. He struggled to reconcile the two images his mind formed, that of his parents, settled in their world of luxuries, and those men and women who had suffered years ago under the indifferent gaze of the Castillos. "Are you sure about all this?" he asked in a tense voice, as if he still clung to the idea of a misunderstanding. Sophia didn't need to press too much. Her expression, her voice, and the evidence spoke for themselves. Finally, Marco understood that she would not abandon this quest. And even though he felt caught between family loyalty and the love he felt for his wife, he made a decision. "I'll help you," he said, with a sigh that sounded like both surrender and determination. "I don't know what we'll find, but if you say there is evidence, we must look for it." That night, Marco ventured into the heart of the family business. He had access to the archives, to old documents that no one had reviewed in years, convinced that there he could find traces of what had happened at the factory. He prepared to face internal bureaucracy, the Castillos' loyal employees who might hinder his task. Still, driven by his newfound conviction, he walked those corridors with a determined frown. In the archive, he found forgotten papers, financial reports with ambiguous data, and official statements that didn't seem to add up. There were records mentioning postponed renovations, ignored warnings about the state of the equipment, and contradictory versions of the incident. He still didn't have conclusive evidence, but the internal consistency of the story Sophia had told him was beginning to become evident. His parents had kept something shameful silent, an episode they should have faced with responsibility and humanity. Upon returning home, exhausted but also with newfound clarity, Marco sat down beside Sophia and recounted what he had found. She listened without interrupting, grateful for his effort and his willingness to believe in her. "Now I understand that this isn't just your fight. It's our fight," said Marco at the end of his account, taking his wife's hands in his. "We have to get to the bottom of this, no matter the consequences." At that moment, something changed between them. Their complicity deepened, grounded not only in the love they felt for each other, but in the cause they now shared. Sophia felt a wave of gratitude, remembering her mother and the workers who demanded justice without being heard. Now, with Marco by her side, she trusted that someday the truth would see the light. The emotional crossroads Marco had faced leaned toward integrity and love. His family ties remained strong, but silence was no longer enough. He had chosen to stand with Sophia and the truth, marking a turning point in their relationship, and in the path they would both walk from that moment on. The side streets of the neighborhood where Ramiro lived wove into a labyrinth of humble houses, cracked walls, and dusty sidewalks. Sophia arrived at his door with her heart in suspense, wondering if that man would be willing to break the pact of silence that seemed to envelop the entire history of the textile factory. She had obtained his name thanks to one of the former workers she had interviewed days earlier. According to what she was told, Ramiro had been the maintenance manager on the day of the fire and had a clear memory of the events. The wooden door, chipped by time, opened cautiously after Sophia's soft knocking. A man with hunched shoulders and deep wrinkles on his forehead peeked out his head. His eyes, darkened by distrust, scanned the figure of the young woman, assessing her carefully. He wore a worn shirt and pants that had seen better days. The precariousness of his conditions was evident, but so was a silent dignity, an inner strength that shone through despite the hardships. "What do you want?" Ramiro asked in a hoarse voice, without fully opening the door. And Sophia took out the newspaper clipping and showed it to him. The faded letters mentioned the fire at the textile factory. Upon pronouncing her mother's name, explaining that she had worked there and was now seeking the truth, she noticed Ramiro's expression changing. The man squinted his eyes, as if a painful memory had emerged from some corner of his memory. Still, at first, he kept his guard up. "Leave," he replied harshly. "I can't help you. I don't want any trouble with the Castillos." Sophia, undeterred, insisted, "Please, I need to know what happened. My mother died without telling me the whole story, and now I understand that she suffered much more than I had imagined. You were there. Perhaps you have something to show me. They have hidden the truth from me for years, but I won't stop now." Those words seemed to pierce through Ramiro's defenses. With a sigh of resignation, the man took a step back and let Sophia enter. He led her to a sparsely furnished room, illuminated only by a small window covered by a tattered curtain. On a small table, bitter coffee steamed in a chipped cup. Ramiro carefully sat down in a chair that creaked under his weight and pointed to a small wooden chest tucked into a corner of the room. "For years I kept these papers," he explained, his gaze fixed on the chest. "The supervisors ordered me to destroy them after the fire, but I couldn't do it. Something inside me told me the truth had to survive, even if no one would listen." Sophia felt her heart race. Ramiro pulled out a folder filled with yellowed pages, reports that seemed about to fall apart at the touch. There were inspection reports with warnings about the deplorable state of the electrical installations, defective machines, lack of adequate emergency exits. He also found internal emails where the supervisors, following the direct orders of Ernesto Castillo, decided to ignore recommendations to avoid incurring additional expenses. Time seemed to stand still as Sophia reviewed that documentation. There was the evidence she had been seeking, a clear trail of negligence and greed that had cost the health and dignity of many workers, including her mother's colleagues. Her stomach churned as she read how the Castillos had used their influence to manipulate the judicial system and evade lawsuits that would have ruined their reputation. That was the confirmation of her worst suspicions. Ramiro watched Sophia in silence, noticing the anger and sadness reflected on her face. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice laden with contained sorrow. "I can't give back what you lost, nor can I erase the injustice of that day. But I can help you seek justice. If needed, I will testify. I know I'm risking the Castillos retaliating, but I can no longer keep silent." Sophia looked up, her eyes moist. Grateful, she took his hand gently. "Thank you, Ramiro. This means a lot. You can't imagine how much." The documentation she now possessed filled her with an intense mix of emotions. She felt anger towards the Castillos, pain for the victims, and a growing hope that by exposing the truth, she could honor her mother's memory and, at the same time, restore dignity to those who had been silenced for so long. With the folder firmly pressed against her chest, Sophia left that humble house. She was clear that she was no longer alone in this fight. She had Ramiro, the women who had shared their stories, and now Marco as well. The path to justice would not be easy, but with that evidence in hand, she was taking a decisive step to illuminate a dark past that the Castillos had tried to hide at all costs. The opportunity for confrontation arose on a night that, on the surface, shouldn't have differed from the others. In the main dining room of the Castillos' residence, the light from the chandeliers reflected off the impeccable glassware, and the velvet-upholstered chairs resembled thrones meant to uphold an unblemished lineage. That environment, always so formal and calculated, was unknowingly preparing for a truth that no one there had wanted to confront. Sophia arrived with Marco arm in arm, dressed with sober elegance. Her gaze showed determination. She was aware that what was about to happen that night had the power to change everything. Carla and Ernesto greeted them with their usual rehearsed smiles, inviting them to sit down as the serving staff brought out the first course. However, Sophia immediately noticed the tension. Carla's hands seemed to grip her napkin more tightly than necessary, and Ernesto maintained a stern expression, as if sensing that the apparent calm would soon unravel. The dinner proceeded in silence for a few minutes. Light conversations crashed against Sophia's determination, who had no intention of wasting time on trivialities. She waited for the right moment, when the service temporarily withdrew and then cleared her throat. Marco, beside her, felt his hand tremble slightly against the tablecloth. He had decided to support Sophia, but that didn't make it any easier to witness what was about to happen. "Carla, Ernesto," Sophia began, her voice firm and measured. "I have been investigating the textile factory that belonged to your family. I found documents, testimonies, evidence that confirms a terrible story." Carla, with a forced grimace, let out a brief, incredulous laugh that echoed in the silence of the room. "Evidence? What are you talking about, Sophia?" She tried to dismiss the accusation with a condescending tone. Sophia remained unfazed. She took a carefully organized folder from her purse. She opened the first page and, with disconcerting firmness, began to read excerpts from inspection reports that pointed out security failures at the factory, defective machinery, inadequate fire suppression systems, and dangerous electrical installations. As she progressed, Carla's grimace began to fade. She tried to maintain her composure, but her fingers clenched the linen tablecloth, revealing her nervousness. "Where did you get that?" Ernesto finally blurted out in a hoarse voice when Sophia showed him a report bearing his signature. His eyes widened more than usual, wavering between disbelief and contained fear. "From someone who worked at your factory," Sophia responded, staring him down. "They handed me documents that you ordered to be destroyed. Additionally, they spoke about how you manipulated the judicial system to avoid lawsuits. Do you remember?" Carla tried to regain control with a derisive laugh. "I don't understand what you're talking about, girl. Things at factories sometimes get out of hand. What are you trying to do? Ruin our family name with unfounded accusations?" But her voice no longer held the arrogant solidity it once did. A subtle tremor was noticeable, a crack opening in their impeccable facade. Marco, from his seat, watched the scene with a queasy stomach. Seeing his parents like this, cornered, trying to deny the undeniable, was a painful experience. However, deep down, he knew Sophia was right, and that the truth needed to come to light. "These aren't unfounded accusations, Carla," Sophia retorted. "I have internal reports, emails that show under Ernesto's leadership, warnings were ignored, and profits were prioritized over the safety of the workers. My mother was one of them, and you ensured that her voice and the voices of the others were never heard." The tension became unbearable. Carla, unable to find an elegant exit, opted for a frontal attack. Enough. Stop digging into the past. What do you gain from this? You're meddling in matters that don't concern you. Sophia straightened her back. Her eyes sparkled with indignation and conviction, undeterred by her mother-in-law's anger. They concern me and everyone who suffered because of your negligence, she said calmly. I won't stop until I uncover the whole truth and restore the honor of those who paid the price for your ambition. The confrontation ended abruptly, without a conciliatory closure. Carla, her face flushed, stood up from the table, leaving her glass half empty. Ernesto followed her, head bowed, as the door closed behind them. Sophia and Marco remained silent, aware that they had crossed a point of no return. There lingered a sense in the air that nothing would ever be the same. Now the truth was no longer a well-kept secret. It had surfaced with the force of an unstoppable current. Sophia was determined. She would get to the bottom of this story, no matter the consequences. And Marco, though pained, seemed willing to accompany her, understanding that integrity was worth more than the impeccable facade of his surname. After the tense confrontation at the family dinner, Carla and Ernesto met alone in the elegant study of the mansion, away from the servants' ears and any occasional visitors. The atmosphere smelled of tanned leather, polished wood, and expensive perfume floating in the air, but that apparent sophistication couldn't mask the nervousness that overwhelmed them. Sophia's attitude had caught them off guard. She wasn't a naive young girl they could easily manipulate, nor another piece on the board they controlled. Her determination, backed by documents and testimonies, was a real threat to the impeccable image the Castillos had cultivated for decades. Ernesto, sitting behind a mahogany desk, fixed his gaze on his wife. We must stop her, Carla. We can't allow her to continue this investigation. Do you realize the risk? Carla, standing beside a bookshelf filled with books whose pages had never been opened, nodded with a tense gesture. Marco refuses to talk to her, she said with irritation. I asked him to convince her to abandon this absurd idea, but he didn't listen. He's starting to distance himself from us. What has that woman done to him? Ernesto shook his head. He knew that Marco wasn't the type to be intimidated by direct orders, and that his ties with Sophia seemed to have strengthened even more since the truth had started to surface. We'll have to act differently, he conceded, with a sigh that showed his exhaustion. The next day, Sophia received an unexpected message from Carla. She was invited to have tea in one of the secondary lounges, a less formal space than the main dining room, with large windows and somewhat more intimate furnishings. Upon arrival, Sophia found Carla and Ernesto already seated, smiling, a gesture too cordial for the tension they knew they shared. In front of them, an elegant folder and a set of perfectly organized documents awaited. We've been thinking about your future, Carla began with a sweet, almost syrupy voice. We know you're a talented seamstress. We want to help you establish your own workshop, a tailoring business that will give you the independence you've always deserved. Sophia didn't need much time to suspect that offer. It was too generous, too timely. She looked at the folder on the table, filled with calculations, investment proposals, and even supplier contacts. It seemed like a solid plan, carefully prepared to tempt her. However, when she looked up, she saw the tension in Ernesto's clenched jaws and the impatient gleam in Carla's eyes. That supposed generosity was nothing but a bribe. What do you want in return? Sophia asked dryly, making it clear she understood the nature of the offer. Carla raised her eyebrows, feigning innocence. Nothing, dear. We just want to see you prosper, to be part of the family with something more than these distractions. Ernesto remained silent, but his gaze was enough to understand that the kind words were a mask. Sophia slid the folder to the center of the table with a dismissive gesture. I appreciate your concern, she said firmly, but I don't need your money. I won't stop my investigation, nor my questions. I know what I'm doing, and I know this means much more than just a business of my own. The cordial facade began to crack. Carla pressed her lips together, her eyes hardened. the subtle threat soon arrived, hidden behind an apparently innocuous warning. "Be careful, Sophia. Sometimes digging into the past can be dangerous. We wouldn't want everyone's well-being to be compromised." It was a veiled threat, and Sophia understood it instantly. She had become an obstacle the Castillos wanted to eliminate, whether with money, social pressure, or intimidation. But far from being cowed, that warning fueled a silent rage within her, a solid determination. Her mother, the forgotten workers, the injustice dragged on for years. Nothing would stop her now. Meanwhile, Marco watched from a distance as his parents unfolded their scheme. That attempt to bribe Sophia, followed by the sinister warning, filled him with indignation. He had never imagined that Ernesto and Carla would go this far. Although he didn't utter a word that afternoon, his silence was more eloquent than any speech. He was beginning to understand that loyalty to his blood family couldn't outweigh the truth and the respect he felt for his wife. That crack Sophia had opened in the foundations of the Castillo family continued to grow. Carla and Ernesto, previously confident in their power, were beginning to realize that their own son was drifting away from them, drawn by Sophia's honesty and courage. And that realization was an even harder blow than the evidence Sophia had presented. Now they knew the battle wasn't just about silencing the truth, but about preventing the loss of what they valued most: their influence, their pride, and ultimately, their own son. In the following weeks, Marco dedicated long hours to delving into the administrative heart of the family business. Holed up in a secondary office, away from the inquisitive gazes of the Castillo's most loyal employees, he sifted through dusty folders, old reports, and haphazardly archived correspondence. The place looked like a mausoleum of yellowed papers, a dusty altar erected to a past everyone had decided to ignore. It was in one of those cardboard boxes, labeled with a distant year and marked with smeared ink, where Marco found the letters that would change the course of his life. They were internal communications between Ernesto and the supervisors of the textile factory, dated weeks before the accident. The first warned about poorly insulated electrical wires and defective ventilation systems. The second insisted on the urgency of repairing emergency exits and reinforcing fire safety measures. And in each message, the tone became more desperate, more urgent. However, the responses signed by Ernesto Castillo painted a chilling picture. With inhuman coldness, the patriarch dismissed the suggested repairs, arguing that they were too costly. One of the letters contained a phrase that chilled Marco to the bone. "It's cheaper to fix it now than handle compensation later." That single line summarized the perverse logic that had guided his father's decisions, prioritizing money over the safety of the workers. Marco slumped into the chair, holding those pages with trembling hands. The image he had of his father, a stern man, but according to him, upright, was cracking with every word he read. Ernesto hadn't just ignored the warnings, he had consciously chosen a path of disdain towards human life. That discovery tarnished the family legacy and called into question everything Marco had taken for granted. Tormented by what he had discovered, Marco returned home with a furrowed brow and a heavy heart. He found Sophia in her small workshop, surrounded by fabrics and sketches of new designs, trying to concentrate on something that would bring her peace. Without preamble, Marco handed her the letters. The young woman read them carefully, in silence, and when she finished, she closed her eyes, as if needing a moment to absorb the magnitude of that cruelty. Her cheeks flushed with indignation, and as she looked up at him, her pupils reflected a mix of anger and pain. "These letters are all we need," Sophia said firmly. "With this, we can prove that your father knew about the danger and still did nothing. It's proof that my mother and the other workers were victims of the vilest negligence." Marco pressed his lips together. He knew Sophia was right. That evidence was a powerful weapon, as devastating as a fire threatening to ruin the Castillo family's reputation. But it was also a burden that would cast doubt on all his father's achievements, the empire he had built, and the legacy that he himself, Marco, had once thought to continue. If this becomes public, Nothing will be left standing, he murmured, almost to himself. The media will destroy my family. What will happen to the employees, the company, the people who depend on it? And what about our life? Will we be able to withstand the scrutiny, the hatred, the consequences? Sophia understood Marco's inner agony. Her mother's struggle had been silenced for too long, and now that they held the key to unlock that door, Marco feared the chaos it would unleash. But she could not betray the memory of her mother or that of the other workers. "And what about them, Marco?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What about the women who lost their livelihoods, their health, their dignity? Is it fair to deny them the truth again? To protect your family, just to keep a clean name on papers already stained with corruption?" The question hit him like a blast of cold wind. In that moment, Marco felt the weight of both loyalties pressing down on his chest. On one side, the family that had raised him, with all its luxuries and traditions. On the other, the woman he loved and the invisible victims crying out from the past for justice. "I don't know what to do," he admitted in a trembling whisper. "I don't know if I have enough courage." Sophia placed her hand over his with a tenderness clouded by sadness. "You're not alone," she said, looking firmly into his eyes. "This is our fight, Marco, but also the future we forge together depends on the integrity with which we face this truth. We will be judged, we will have enemies, but we will have something more valuable, a clear conscience." The tension was palpable. Marco felt the knife's edge against his conscience, with Sophia's love and the family legacy vying for his soul. Meanwhile, Sophia struggled to keep her determination intact. The dilemma was inescapable. Expose Ernesto, risking the family's reputation and many people's livelihoods, or remain silent and carry a guilt that would never fade. Neither knew how it would end, but they understood that this moment would mark a before and after, not only for them, but for all the lives touched by the flames of that fire and the lies that followed. The accumulated pressures seemed to have reached a critical point. The atmosphere in the Castillo home was heavy, laden with a tension that made it hard to breathe. Marco, trapped between his conscience and his parents' authority, was on the verge of yielding to the doubts Ernesto and Carla had sown in his mind. Until then, he had tried to balance two worlds, but the rope was beginning to fray. Ernesto, aware of his son's wavering, summoned him to his study one grey afternoon, while Carla kept some distance, like a silent witness ready to intervene at the right moment. The room, with its dark wood furniture and family portraits hung on the walls, seemed to exert psychological pressure on Marco, reminding him of the weight of the surname he bore. "Are you willing to destroy your family over a moral crusade?" Ernesto asked bluntly, his eyes fixed on Marco's. There were no shouts or banging on the desk, only the icy serenity of someone who knew he was in a position of power. Marco shuddered at the question. He knew exactly what it meant. The evidence he and Sophia had gathered, the truth his parents wanted to keep hidden. "It's not that, Father," he began, trying to formulate an argument. "Then what is it?" Ernesto interrupted. "Do you think a woman who doesn't even understand the magnitude of what's at stake can dictate our family's destiny?" Marco felt a knot in his throat. He had loved Sophia sincerely, admired her courage and honesty. But now Ernesto's words made him doubt. Meanwhile, Carla stepped forward a few paces, adopting a gentler, almost maternal tone, though the tension did not lessen. "Son, we worked hard to give you a comfortable life, the best opportunities. Don't you remember?" she said, with a feigned sweetness. "Sophia is using you, manipulating your sensitivity. She doesn't understand the world we live in. She doesn't comprehend the repercussions of her actions." Carla's strategy was clear. Appeal to affection, shared history, the emotional dependence Marco felt toward his parents. Faced with such an onslaught, Marco wavered. His convictions began to falter. What if he really was about to undo everything his family had built? What if Sophia, in her quest for justice, ignored the catastrophic consequences this might have? That same night, Sophia asked Marco to accompany her to a meeting with some of the former factory workers. She wanted him to hear their testimonies firsthand, to understand the magnitude of the harm caused. But Marco, consumed by doubts and fear of crossing a point of no return, refused. "I'm not sure it's a good idea," he said, avoiding her gaze. "Once we do this, there's no going back." Sophia looked at him in disbelief, her heart shrinking. She had placed her trust in him, believed he was her partner in this struggle. Seeing him back down now hurt more than any offense from Carla or Ernesto. "No going back?" Sophia repeated, her voice choked. "Do you really think there's any going back for the victims? They've already lived through the tragedy. Their chance at a fair future was snatched away. And you don't want to cross a point of no return. That point came the day we decided to seek the truth." Marco had no response. That was the hardest blow he could receive from the woman he loved. His silence was his answer, a silence filled with guilt and confusion. Sophia understood she couldn't wait any longer for him, that Ernesto and Carla's words had ensnared him. It pained her, like a deep, incurable wound, but she had to continue alone. She rose and looked at him with a resolve as unyielding as her sorrow. "If you can't stand by my side in this, then you never really were," she said, her voice mixing disappointment and determination. The words hung in the air, marking an irreversible breaking point between them. Sophia left without looking back, determined to follow her path, even if it meant distancing herself from Marco. At that moment, the cracks that had appeared in their relationship turned into insurmountable chasms, and Sophia's solitude rose like a banner of struggle against the darkness the Castillos insisted on maintaining. Sophia walked through streets that barely remembered their days of industrial splendor. There, among flaking buildings and makeshift workshops, she found the former workers who had been first-hand witnesses to the factory's hidden miseries. It wasn't easy to earn their trust, as fear and resignation had clung to their lives like a second skin. Many lived with physical and emotional after-effects. Others had spent decades in poverty, with no one to turn to or any protection. At first, when she mentioned the Castillo name, she was met with evasive looks, prolonged silences, and deflection. But Sophia, with her steadfastness, managed to plant a seed of hope among them. She explained that she had found documents, that she had testimonies from some of their colleagues, and that she knew the truth that had remained buried under threats and hush money. She spoke of her mother, and how this fight was to honor her memory and that of all those women who had been relegated to oblivion. It was that sincerity that convinced a few to break their silence. Little by little, the workers began sharing their stories. They spoke of exhausting shifts without proper safety measures, of improvement requests ignored, and of the fire. That peak moment that marked a before and after in their lives. Their voices trembled as they remembered the smoke, the flames, the terror etched into their retinas. Many bore scars, not just on their skin, but in their memories. These painful but necessary testimonies became the emotional foundation of the case Sophia was trying to build. Another unexpected ally joined this collective force. Javier, an independent journalist known for not being intimidated by corporate or political pressure. Specializing in labor justice and corporate corruption, Javier became immediately interested when Sophia described the magnitude of the evidence, internal documents, letters signed by Ernesto Castillo, records of ignored inspections. The journalist, calm-voiced and inquisitive-eyed, saw in this story the chance to expose a paradigmatic case of employer negligence and systematic cover-up. Together, Sophia and Javier locked themselves for hours in a small downtown cafe, surrounded by papers, recorded testimonies, and computer screens filled with messy notes. The smell of strong coffee kept them alert as they reviewed every detail, assembling the pieces with patience and precision. Javier marveled at Sophia's tenacity, and she appreciated the professionalism with which he tackled the task. When the journalist began drafting the article's first version, they knew this text could be the fuse that would shake the pillars supporting the Castillo's prestige. The investigation was not without obstacles. Some witnesses hesitated to go public, fearing reprisals. It was understandable. The Castillos had shown they would not stand idly by. Their wealth and influence could easily close doors, silence reports, and pressure anyone who dared to denounce them. Sophia, however, refused to give in. She knew the strength of truth lay in persistence, in gathering multiple voices and overcoming fear. Each new piece of the puzzle reinforced Sophia's determination. Her mother would have been proud to see her demanding justice not just for herself, but for all the invisible victims treated as mere numbers in a ledger. For the first time, Sophia felt she was moving in a concrete direction, as if she had found a roadmap amid the chaos. Still, she was aware that the game was far from over. The Castillos' veiled threats, their influence in the press and spheres of power, and the victims' own fragility formed a difficult barrier to break. But now she had allies, the workers who had raised their voices, and Javier, the journalist committed to truth. Together, they were building a solid front that, while it did not guarantee victory, at least promised not to surrender without a fierce fight. As night fell and the city lights shimmered over the worn asphalt, Sophia said goodbye to Javier with a handshake and a knowing look. With each step she took toward home, the echo of the stories she had heard, the smell of coffee, the trembling hands of the witnesses, and the determination of the independent journalist accompanied her. She had a clear purpose: to expose the truth so many had tried to hide, tear down walls of silence, and show that despite threats and power, justice could find its way into the light. Until now, Sophia's struggle had been silent and measured, but it was beginning to face a new dimension: the active vengeance of Carla and Ernesto. The couple, aware of the danger that stubborn young woman represented, left behind subtle threats and moved on the offensive, using their network of contacts and influence to fabricate a toxic narrative around her. The first thrust came through the business circle. Overnight, some doors that seemed ajar for the growth of Sophia's sewing workshop slammed shut with a deafening crash. Entrepreneurs who had previously greeted her with tense smiles and vague promises now hid behind flimsy excuses. Carla, pulling strings behind the scenes, spread rumors about Sophia's intentions. She portrayed her as a ruthless opportunist, willing to attack her own in-laws just for financial gain. The suggestion worked, especially among those who admired the Castillos' reputation or feared displeasing them. At social gatherings, Sophia's name started to be spoken with a certain disdain. Some called her an opportunist. Others whispered that she exploited past suffering to blackmail the wealthy family she had married into. It mattered little that there was no evidence to support these rumors. The mere prestige of Ernesto and Carla was enough for many to believe them without question. It was an unequal war in which they used their aura of respectability to discredit her without presenting a single shred of proof. But the attack didn't stop at her reputation. Ernesto, fearing the impact of Javier's upcoming article, turned to his connections in publishing to pressure magazines and newspapers that were considering running the story. He promised to withdraw advertising, deny exclusive interviews, and cut ties with anyone daring to spread the truth. Most media outlets, wary of losing revenue and influence, became reluctant to publish the report. Javier, outraged, shared with Sophia the frustration of seeing their investigation thwarted by a wall of interests. The pressure on Sophia grew by the day. Every step forward was repelled by a new barrier, erected with meticulous coldness by Carla and Ernesto. Potential sponsors evaded her. Her projects to expand her workshop ran into inexplicable rejections. For the first time, the young woman felt emotional exhaustion undermining her strength. Nights grew long and tense, plagued by insomnia, fueled by helplessness and rage. Her mental health began to suffer: constant headaches, palpitations, and a heavy feeling in her chest that never seemed to ease. However, despite everything, her determination remained unshaken. Every humiliation, every poisonous whisper, every obstacle the Castillos placed in her path only reinforced her conviction. She now understood that it wasn't just about one powerful family, but a system that protected the privileged at the expense of those with less voice. It was no coincidence that so many had remained silent for so many years, that no one had raised a hand to point out the injustices. It was the product of well-greased gears, a machinery of silence, complicity, and fear. Sophia now comprehended the magnitude of her struggle. She didn't just fight to honor her mother's memory, to vindicate the sacrifice of the workers who had remained invisible after the factory's flames. She also fought for all those victims who had never found justice, for the silenced voices and the hands that worked in the shadows without receiving the protection they deserved. Her cause had become something greater, a drive to break the invisible chains that maintained the status quo. With each new blockade, Sophia refused to retreat. She sought new strategies, strengthened alliances with those still willing to listen, and remembered the people who supported her, the workers who shared their testimonies with both fear and courage, and the journalist Javier, who, despite the threats, persisted in finding a way to spread the truth. She continued to rise each morning with the conviction that justice deserved any effort, any sacrifice. In that whirlwind of rumors and pressures, Sophia found a new clarity. The Castillo's might was not invincible. It was based on fear, opacity, and the inertia of a system designed for the strongest. In this realization, she found renewed motivation. If she could persevere, if she managed to push through the dense fog of lies, she could light the way for others. And that idea, devastating as her situation might be, drove her to never give up. Sophia expected to meet Ernesto in the main study of the Castillo mansion, a place she already knew from previous tense encounters. The room looked the same as ever. The mahogany desk, the austere family portraits, the aroma of leather and expensive perfume. Yet the atmosphere felt more oppressive than ever. The afternoon light, filtered through heavy curtains, turned yellowish and cold at the same time, as if foretelling the nature of the conversation that was about to take place. Ernesto awaited her, seated in his large, high-backed armchair. When Sophia entered, he did not rise to greet her. His gaze, sharp and fixed, reminded her of a predator stalking its prey. There was an arrogant confidence in his bearing that was unsettling. He didn't need to hide his intentions behind false niceties. It was evident he was there to corner her. "You know, Sophia," Ernesto said, giving a half-smile, "you've been very stubborn so far, and I have to acknowledge that can be admirable under certain circumstances. But you've gone too far. You've put my family, our reputation, and our legacy in check, and it's time to put an end to this game." Sophia, chin raised, held his gaze. Though her heart pounded heavily, she would not show fear. She had come too far, more than many would have ever imagined, and she would not allow a man used to getting his way to intimidate her. "What do you mean, Ernesto?" she asked calmly, though she felt latent tension in her jaw. "Your mother," he replied abruptly, eyes locked on hers. "I know you've waved her memory like a banner of justice, presenting her as a victim fighting oppression. But what would others think if they found out she wasn't as brave as you say?" A chill ran down Sophia's spine. She watched Ernesto slowly pull some papers from a drawer. The mere mention of her mother, that noble figure who had always inspired her, placed her in a state of unavoidable vulnerability. "I have documents," Ernesto continued, "that prove that after the accident at the factory, your mother signed a confidentiality agreement, a piece of paper that allowed her to keep her job in exchange for her silence. What do you think the journalists will say when they find out Sophia's mother wasn't that incorruptible heroine everyone imagines? What will they think when they see your crusade as a hypocritical act, based on a false idea of family integrity?" Ernesto's words were like knives, each one sliced into the ideal image Sophia held of her mother. She could not blame the woman who gave her life for acting that way. Those were hard times, and her mother, ill and in need, might not have had another choice. But the threat of revealing this to the public could destroy her credibility. It could make many question the legitimacy of her fight, seeing her as a daughter deceived by her own fantasy. "If you continue," Ernesto added coldly, "I will reveal everything. Your reputation will fall to pieces, and with it, your marriage to Marco. Do you think he'll withstand media pressure and disgrace? Do you think he won't turn away when everything comes crashing down? If you persist, Sophia, I assure you that everything you love will lie in ruins. The internal agony Sophia felt was atrocious. She felt nauseated imagining the headlines, the public's reaction, and the disappointment in Marco's eyes, who had already shown doubts. She knew Ernesto did not speak in vain, that he had the power to turn her life into a media hell. Yet despite the horror those threats painted, something stronger beat within her, the conviction that she stood on the right side of history. "I'm not fighting out of revenge, I'm fighting for justice," Sophia responded, her voice trembling but firm. Rage, sadness, and determination mingled inside her, lending her words an unbreakable quality. "And nothing my mother did to survive in that context erases the damage you caused or the truths I've already uncovered. I will not stop, Ernesto. I will not be intimidated." The look Ernesto gave her was cutting, but something in his expression seemed shaken by Sophia's integrity. He left the room without turning his back, as if he considered her a worthy yet undesirable adversary. Sophia remained there, in the silence of the study, heart pounding and acutely aware of her loneliness. She understood that the path to justice would not come with easy rewards, that the vulnerability she felt would not disappear just by keeping her head held high. From now on, she might have to walk the path without the friendly hands she hoped to find along the way. Still, she would not retreat. The promise she had made, the memory of her mother, the dignity of the workers who had suffered in silence. All of it pushed Sophia forward, even though she knew her struggle was about to become more solitary and painful than ever. Ernesto's threat had left her reeling, as if an icy wind had swept away the certainties Sophia had worked so hard to accumulate. For days, the fear that her mother's past might be used against her weighed like a slab on her chest. She felt more alone than ever, afraid that Ernesto's words could destroy what remained of her reputation and irreparably damage her relationship with Marco. Yet despite that sense of fragility, Sophia was not as alone as the patriarch of the Castillos wanted her to believe. Ramiro showed up one morning, with a tired face but a steady gaze, holding a worn-out folder in his hands. Since deciding to help her, the former factory employee had not stopped searching for any additional clue that might strengthen the case. Now, speaking calmly, he explained that he had found documents he never dared to show anyone before. Contracts that the supervisors had signed under Ernesto Castillo's direct instruction. These papers detailed warnings about the deplorable state of the electrical system, the lack of adequate safety measures, and repeated requests for improvements that were never addressed. Each sheet was a reminder that the accident had not been an inevitable tragedy, but the direct consequence of greed and contempt for human life. Sophia reviewed the documents with great care, feeling a quiet anger that drove her forward. She knew these new findings, added to the workers' testimonies, the internal letters, and the evidence she already possessed, would form an unbreakable pillar for her case. For the first time, she felt she held the power to change the narrative Ernesto and Carla had built over the years. Meanwhile, Javier, the independent journalist, fought his own battle. When the main publishing houses, more or less influenced by the Castillo family, refused to print the story, he turned to an independent digital outlet known for its commitment to truth and resilience against external pressures. There, the article that had been so difficult to write finally saw the light. Javier's words, direct and well documented, crudely exposed the Castillo's role in the accident, as well as the cover-up tactics used afterward. The online publication, far from being marginalized, found an echo on social media. Within days, Javier's words and Sophia's story multiplied, shared by anonymous users, labor activists, local journalists, and even some international media outlets looking for powerful stories of social justice. Public pressure began to grow, a wave carrying the victims' names, Sophia's courage, and Javier's perseverance. Suddenly, the Castillo family could no longer control the narrative so easily. Doubts about their honor and responsibility in the incident circulated freely, impossible to silence with a mere snap of the fingers. In the face of the media uproar, Carla and Ernesto's hostile tactics confronted a force greater than themselves: public opinion. For every unfounded rumor they launched against Sophia, new testimonies emerged from other victims who had remained silent. The credibility of the accusations was no longer measured only in the corridors of power, but in the collective conscience. And though the Castillos had resources to strike back, the damage to their image was becoming noticeable. In the midst of that storm, Sophia found comfort in the workers who had joined her cause. Their words of support and recognition of her courage granted her inner strength that surpassed fear and fatigue. Some called her brave with admiration. Others simply shook her hand in silence, grateful that someone would raise their voice for those who had gone decades unheard. This network of solidarity became a shelter against the pressures surrounding her. Emotionally exhausted, but armed with new evidence and growing public support, Sophia felt she had reached a key point in her struggle. Neither Ernesto's threats nor Carla's smear campaigns could stop her now. The determination that throbbed in her chest, that fire that drove her not to retreat, was her greatest strength. In her mind there was no doubt. The truth would eventually prevail, and she was willing to see it through to the end. The day Marco confronted his father, the atmosphere in the Castillo mansion was suffocating. The late afternoon light filtered through the windows, tinting the walls with a yellowish hue, while Ernesto and Marco observed each other from opposite ends of the study. There were no witnesses or murmuring servants in the distance. They were alone, father and son, face to face, with the family history on the verge of shattering into 1,000 pieces. "How long did you plan to keep it hidden?" Marco asked, his voice hoarse, barely containing the rage burning in his chest. "How many lives were ruined by this family's greed? How many lies did you tell to cover up what happened at the factory?" Ernesto, unperturbed, settled into his armchair. His habitual strategy was to deny, minimize, divert attention. He had done it so many times that the script almost slipped from his mouth by inertia. But this time, Marco's gaze was different. He no longer had that insecurity that used to make him hesitate. "Son, everything we did was to protect you, to guarantee you a secure future," Ernesto said in a paternal tone, his expression unchanged. "Everything was done for the good of the family." Marco clenched his fists, feeling those words as the final affront. For years he had accepted his father's version, believed in his values, or at least tried not to question them. Now he saw it clearly. The supposed love for the family was nothing more than an excuse to crush others under the weight of their empire. "You can't call it a future if it's built on other people's ruins," Marco spat bitterly. "No excuse justifies what you did. Neither I nor anyone else can benefit from a destiny stained by the blood and misery of innocent people." Ernesto remained silent for a few moments. He seemed surprised by the tone and determination he perceived in his son. Perhaps he had expected Marco to yield with an empty promise or to hesitate, recalling the comfort he had always enjoyed. But this time, Marco did not waver. Seeing his father's inflexibility only filled him with more revulsion. Without another word, he turned and left the study. That night, Marco went to meet Sophia. He found her in the small sewing workshop she continued trying to get off the ground, despite all the obstacles. Amid threads, scraps of fabric, and unfinished sketches, Sophia looked up as he entered. There was fatigue in her eyes, but also a resilience that made her shine. "I spoke with my father," Marco said bluntly. "Now I see it clearly. I know the harm they caused, and I won't be complicit in this." Sophia felt something inside her relax. She had dreamed of hearing these words, of seeing Marco take a stand by her side. There had been moments when she believed it impossible. His loyalty to his family, his silence, his evasions, all suggested that he would never fully break those ties. But there he was, confessing his unconditional support, willing to sacrifice whatever was necessary. "I don't want you to suffer the consequences, Marco," Sophia murmured, her voice laden with affection. "I know this won't be easy for you." Marco stepped closer and gently took her hand. "None of this will be easy, Sophia," he replied. "But if protecting you and honoring the truth means breaking with my family, I'll do it. I'm on your side, no conditions." That moment marked a milestone in their relationship. For the first time, Sophia felt that Marco understood the weight of her struggle, the burden she had carried on her shoulders. At the same time, Marco understood that siding with the truth meant fighting against everything he believed immovable. As a gesture of his commitment, he confessed that he had found additional evidence in the company archives incriminating Ernesto and the supervisors. "I will testify against my father," he announced determinedly. "I'll provide everything I found. I don't want a future built on others' suffering. I want those responsible to face the consequences, and I want the memory of your mother and the other workers to be redeemed." Sophia felt the air in that small workshop fill with a new kind of hope. She was no longer alone against the monster of power and oppression. Now she had Marco at her side, stronger than ever, willing to tear down the walls of silence his family had erected. The story took a turn, and though the road to justice remained long and fraught, now they would walk it together, convinced that the truth had to prevail. The grand business event organized by the Castillos took place in a hall filled with polished lights and lavish decorations. The tables, covered with linen tablecloths, displayed impeccable crystalware and lush floral centerpieces. Influential personalities from the world of business, fashion, and politics attended with rehearsed smiles and champagne glasses in hand. The official objective was to announce a new textile project that Ernesto and Carla claimed would mark a milestone in the industry. However, that setting of luxury and prestige was about to become the moral battlefield Sophia had been preparing for weeks. With Javier's help, the journalist who had risked his reputation for the truth, and with the former factory workers, Sophia had planned a precise blow to the narrative the Castillos had carefully woven for decades. On the stage, Ernesto prepared to give his speech. Dressed in an impeccable suit, he wore the calculated smile of someone who believes himself in control. Carla, seated in the front row, held a costly fan she waved elegantly. Around them, applause sounded more like protocol than genuine enthusiasm. Then, just as Ernesto raised his voice to utter the first words, Sophia made her way through the crowd, pushing toward the stage. The security guards, caught off guard, barely reacted. Javier, mingling among the guests, recorded everything with his camera and microphone, ready to broadcast what would happen. Ramiro and other victims of the factory, stationed strategically, awaited the signal to intervene. When Sophia stepped onto the stage, a murmur spread like a shockwave through the audience. Some recognized her. Others wondered who this woman was, willing to interrupt the event so blatantly. "Excuse the interruption," Sophia said, taking the microphone, "but there is a truth that needs to be heard. The Castillo family has spent years hiding their responsibility in the fire at one of their textile factories, an accident that caused suffering and ruined the lives of many workers, including my mother." A heavy silence settled over the room. With a firm voice, Sophia displayed the documents and photographs she had so carefully guarded. She projected images on a screen Javier had helped install in secret. She showed internal letters, contracts, ignored warnings, testimonies of former employees. She presented an irrefutable case before an audience that had never doubted the Castillos' spotless image. "These women," she continued, her voice breaking at the memory of her mother, "dedicated their lives to honest work. They were demanded to work long hours with few resources and no safety measures. When they warned of risks, the Castillos ignored them. When the accident happened, they were left to their fate, with empty promises and agreements that forced them to remain silent." A tense murmur rose among the audience. Everyone turned to look at Ernesto and Carla, waiting for their response. Ramiro, walking unsteadily but resolutely, climbed the stage and took the microphone. His testimony was brief but devastating, recounting the deplorable conditions in which they worked, the dismissal threats, the unmet promises. Other victims followed his example, sharing their stories before an audience that could no longer deny the evidence. Each word was a dagger tearing through the untouchable image the Castillos had upheld for so long. The tension was so dense it seemed to materialize in the air. Carla, pale with rage and fear, stood up trying to silence the voices. "This is a farce," she shouted in a shrill voice. "Don't listen to this woman. She just wants to destroy our family for personal gain." But the evidence was too solid. The documents on the screen, the photographs, the letters signed by Ernesto, the broken voices of the victims. None of that could be dismissed with a simple outburst. Before Carla could snatch the microphone away, Marco rose from the audience. He wore a dark suit and his face bore marks of guilt and determination. With firm steps, he approached the stage, placing himself beside Sophia and the victims. A murmur ran through the hall as people understood the importance of this gesture. "Enough, Mother," Marco said firmly, looking at Carla and then at the audience. "Sophia is telling the truth. My father and you knew what was happening at the factory. I've seen the documents. I know the evidence. I've been blind for too long. Today, I choose truth and justice." Carla stepped back, stunned. Ernesto, speechless, watched the scene from the stage, unable to react. The audience realized they were witnessing a moral collapse, the downfall of a family myth. Marco, publicly distancing himself from his family, marked a turning point. There was no turning back now. The story the Castillos had invented crumbled before the cameras, the journalists, and the public's critical eye. Sophia felt a wave of mixed relief and pain. She had reached the pinnacle of her struggle, exposing the truth to the world. She clung to the victims' trembling hands, finding in them the courage to keep her head held high. Marco's support, endorsing every word, provided a resounding closure to that act of bravery. The hall fell silent, broken only by camera flashes and whispered astonishment. In that instant, Sophia knew that despite the price everyone had paid, the truth had prevailed. And that was the greatest victory they could have imagined. The repercussions of the event were immediate. As soon as images of Sophia revealing the truth in public and Marco backing her words were released, the world began to react. National and international media took up the story, broadcasting fragments of the speech, photographs of the documents, and the victims' testimonies. On social media, the wave of outrage spread at lightning speed. Hashtags demanding justice and messages of support for Sophia multiplied within hours. The family company's stock value plummeted immediately, and worried investors bombarded Ernesto's office with calls. Former business allies, once so close, now kept a cold distance, fearing they might be splashed by the scandal. Far from the grand boardrooms in the streets and workshops, people began saying Sophia's name out loud, with respect and admiration. She was seen as someone who had the courage to confront corruption and lies, fueling a movement that demanded accountability and business ethics. Ernesto could not evade the consequences of his actions. Labor and judicial authorities initiated formal investigations into the factory's practices, reviewing old records, ignored inspections, and opaque transactions. The family's lawyers worked against the clock, trying to minimize damage, but the pressure was immense. Carla, who initially reacted with anger and contempt, began to crumble beneath the magnitude of the scandal. The haughty, self-assured figure gave way to a more fragile person who could no longer hide the cracks in her morality. One day, Ernesto asked to speak with Sophia in private. It was a sober meeting, far from the bustle of the media, in a room that had once hosted brilliant receptions. Now, the dim light filtering through the windows and the charged silence reflected a much more intimate and painful moment of truth. Sophia arrived without expecting effusive apologies or contrite acts, aware that a man like Ernesto would not change easily. Even so, she stood her ground firmly. "I've read the news, seen the reactions," Ernesto began, his voice stripped of arrogance. "I understand that nothing I say can repair the damage I caused, but I can't deny what's in front of me. Many people have suffered because of my decisions." He ran a trembling hand over his forehead, as if trying to erase the wrinkles drawn by years of cynicism. "I can't change what I did," he continued, "but I want to try to repair some of the damage." Despite the neutrality of his tone, Sophia perceived a different nuance in him. It was not a full confession, nor a public remorse, but a tacit acknowledgement of guilt. For years, Ernesto had covered up the truth, ignored warnings, and degraded lives for the sake of his empire. Now that empire was collapsing, and with it, the image Ernesto had cultivated of himself. Sophia took a deep breath, trying to control the mixture of emotions overwhelming her. She did not feel compassion for Ernesto's suffering, but she recognized the value of that admission, however minimal it was. "What you do from now on depends on you, Ernesto," she said calmly. "Repairing the damage means listening to those who were silenced, offering fair restitution, and facing legal consequences. It's not my forgiveness you should seek, but justice for them." Later, Carla also approached Sophia. The woman who once displayed disdain now showed evident fatigue on her face. Her eyes, once haughty, seemed filled with sadness. "I regret having contributed to this farce," Carla said, her voice faintly broken. "My pride and prejudices kept me from seeing who you really are, Sophia. I didn't understand your determination. I refuse to hear your truth. I know I can't undo the damage, but I acknowledge that my actions made everything worse." Sophia nodded with restrained composure. She was not ready to forgive Carla, nor did she wish to pretend that a few words could erase years of contempt and silence. Even so, the confession marked a turning point, a first step, timid, insufficient, but real, toward recognizing shared guilt. Her relationship with the Castillos remained tense. Sophia felt no need to forge an emotional bond with those who had belittled her mother and herself. Yet she perceived the start of a change. Ernesto, subjected to legal processes and public pressure, was forced to take responsibility, to atone in part for the harm done. Carla, shaken in her vanity, was confronted with the reality of her own role in the tragedy. At that crucial moment, Sophia understood that her struggle had borne fruit not only by exposing the crime, but also by opening a path toward rectification. Although it would never compensate for the loss of so many truncated lives, at least the truth was now on the table, demanding justice, calling for honest transformation. The masks had fallen, and with that, the absolute dominion that the Castillos had once exerted over their own story and that of others began to slip away. Sophia did not know what the future held, but amid the uncertainty, she felt the scales begin to tip, if only slightly, toward justice. And that subtle shift, that crack in the wall of impunity, was the beginning of a hope that decades ago no one would have thought possible. With the media frenzy calming down and the truth finally laid bare before the world, Sophia's name was no longer synonymous with doubt or controversy, but with strength and justice. In the weeks following the investigations and the collapse of the Castillos' reputation, Sophia found herself contemplating a future that, in earlier times, would have seemed unattainable. She said goodbye to the ruins of old family power, to the mansion where she had so often felt small and unwelcome. She left behind the cold salons and conversations full of falsehood and privilege. Now, her horizon lay in a place entirely different, a modest but bright workshop, located in a neighborhood steeped in honest work, calloused hands, and laughter that echoed in the streets at lunchtime. The sewing workshop Sophia founded was not just a business, but a living tribute to her mother and to all the women who had once placed their hope, talent, and strength at the service of an industry that rarely acknowledged them. The walls were decorated with old photographs, some of her mother holding a needle with her characteristic serenity, others of the workers who had once suffered negligence and disdain. Now these images were not voiceless cries, but testimony to the change Sophia was determined to inspire. There, in addition to lovingly and meticulously sewing garments, Sophia offered training to women from the community. Many arrived with trembling hands, uncertain gazes, voices faltering as they recounted their own stories of precariousness and enforced silence. However, the warmth of the environment and the solidarity blossoming among the seamstresses restored their confidence. In no time, these women learned to operate the machines, to design patterns, to recognize the value of their work. The clothes they produced did not seek ostentatious luxury, but rather the dignity of the maker and the authenticity of the wearer. Marco, now free of the burden of his family's name and past, had definitively distanced himself from the Castillo's business. It had been a painful process, like tearing off a piece of his own skin, but it was necessary. Now, upon crossing the threshold of Sophia's workshop, he found a place without deceit or hollow appearances. He found the sound of sincere laughter, the smell of freshly cut fabric, and the steady heartbeat of a project built on principles he himself had chosen to embrace: honesty, respect, and love. Together with Sophia, Marco got involved in every task, from negotiating with fairer suppliers to helping with the workshop's logistics. Little by little, he learned to appreciate daily effort, to recognize the satisfaction of seeing someone master a craft, to celebrate the small victories. The couple, united by the fire of adversity, now found a comforting peace. They had overcome lies, threats, betrayals, and fears. They had lost a false stability to gain a truly authentic present. The shadows of the past still existed, yes, but they no longer had the power to intimidate. Ernesto and Carla faced the consequences of their actions. The factory's victims began to see signs of reparation, and the public finally understood the magnitude of the battle Sophia had fought. Meanwhile, Sophia and Marco did not look back with bitterness, but with the serenity of those who know that the truth, however harsh and delayed, had found its way. One afternoon, as the sun gilded the streets, Sophia paused in the workshop's doorway and gazed inside. The machines humming a constant rhythm of work, the women laboring with heads held high, the colorful threads hanging from simple shelves. She felt her mother's presence in every detail, in every stitch joining the garments, in every smile blossoming on their focused faces. This was the legacy that truly mattered, the strength to transform pain into resilience, injustice into a driving force towards something better. Marco, beside her, slipped an arm over her shoulders, smiling conspiratorially. They had plans to expand the workshop, to offer free classes to young people eager to learn the trade, to partner with other ethical cooperatives. They shared dreams built not on false promises, but on honest work and sincere hope. As night fell, the workshop's lights glowed like a warm beacon in the neighborhood. Sophia and Marco stepped out, hand in hand, strolling leisurely toward their home. The times of silence and submission were behind them. Now they lived freely, in charge of their own decisions, embarking on a path where the past was not a burden, but a lesson, helping them build a more just, more human future, full of new possibilities. Now, on a bright morning, the workshop's courtyard was filled with sounds: laughter, lively conversation, the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. A motley group of people had gathered, women who had reclaimed their dignity through sewing, young apprentices eager to make their mark, and families grateful for the bread earned through honest work. Among them, Sophia and Marco stood out for their serenity, united by a history of pain overcome and truth vindicated. With steady hands, Sophia and Marco dug into the soil, while the workers and their families watched with curiosity and enthusiasm. A small tree awaited its new home, a sapling with bright green leaves symbolizing the growth they all experienced. Weeks earlier, that space had been just an ordinary patio with no particular identity. Now, by planting something living and lasting, they reflected the cycle of change they had begun. When the tree's roots touched the fresh earth, Sophia took a moment to look at those around her. She recognized grateful looks in the women to whom her workshop had given a chance, the pride of those who had transformed their fears into skills, and the understanding smile of a renewed Marco, a man who, after renouncing a tarnished legacy, found a nobler purpose at her side. The community's hubbub, murmurs, and applause grew in intensity. Children ran about, guided by the innocence of those who know only the present. There were elderly women holding their heads high, happy to see that the work of their hands had not vanished into oblivion. And there were men and women who, having suffered the consequences of an unjust system, now looked to the future with renewed hope. Sophia felt a deep peace. She knew it had not been an easy path. She remembered the fire of indignation, the threats, the exhaustion, the losses. She also remembered Ramiro's steady hand, Javier's encouraging words, and Marco's ultimate determination. She remembered the broken voices of the victims who, by raising the truth, had sown the seeds of this better present. They had honored her mother's memory, and through that, given a voice to those who needed it. There were no luxuries, no grand headlines, no gleaming stages, only work, honesty, solidarity, and the commitment to learn from past mistakes to build a fairer tomorrow. In that tree, in its strong roots and trunk pointing toward the sky, Sophia saw a reflection of her own transformation. She had turned pain into an unstoppable force, and the shadows of yesterday into a path toward the light. And that's all for today. Thank you for joining us in this story. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to subscribe, hit like, and share it with your friends. See you in the next video. Farewell.